Students, welcome back. Now we will discuss about the international trade theory and development strategy. Okay, you can find this topic in chapter 12 in your textbook. Let's begin. The economic globalization and introduction. So we have many interpretation for globalization, right? Well, if we talk about the context in economics, then the core economic meaning is the increased openness of economies to international trade, financial flows, and the foreign direct investment. So basically, if the production factor such as labor, capital, and also cash, they can travel freely internationally, then that's kind of the definition of globalization in terms of economics. Oh, and also if we can sell our output, our product, goods and services internationally, that's also the definition of globalization. So concerns with globalization center around the unevenness of the process and risk. Okay. These are some key issues regarding international trade. So many developing countries rely heavily on exports of primary products with attendant risk and uncertainty. Like for example, our export consists of coal and fuel. Yeah, that's an example of rely heavily on export of primary products. And then many developing countries also rely heavily on imports. Like for example, do you notice that all of the cars and motorcycles that we have mostly are imported from other countries? So that's an example of fact that we rely heavily on imports. Yep, like machinery in here, capital goods, and the intermediate producer goods and consumer products. Oh, like your cell phone, for example. Most of you probably own iPhone or Samsung. Yeah, they are import. And then many developing countries have chronic deficit on current and capital accounts. So deficit on the current and capital accounts is some key issue with the international trade, which depletes their reserves, cause currency instability, and may slow economic growth. Okay. You will definitely learn about this more in your international economics course, but we will just briefly discuss about it in this course. And then recently, many developing countries sought to promote export and accumulate large foreign exchange reserve to cushion against crisis. Okay. Oh, crisis, sorry. And then these are 5 basic questions about trade and development. So, how does the international trade affect economic growth? And how does trade alter the distribution of income? And then how can trade promote development? And then can developing countries determine how much they trade? And is an outward-looking or an inward-looking trade policy best? We will discuss some of these questions today. Okay, in this part, let's underline the importance of exports to different developing nations. Okay, so export of developing countries are generally less diverse than those of developed countries. Like, for example, if you take Kenya, for example, Kenya is a developing country, and I assume their main exports are coffee, maybe. Brazil, maybe one of their main exports are agricultural products like coffee, for example. Let's compare it with like Japan, for example. Japan's export varies, right? They export machine, they export vehicle, but they also export salt. So because they have large salt production, and they might also export fish, maybe. So they are diverse, right? The export from developed countries and then developing countries. And then merchandise export as share of GDP are often higher for developing countries. So this is also true. So this is the table that show the merchandise exports in perspective. You can compare developing countries and developed countries in here. The merchandise export and their GDP, and then merchandise export as share of GDP, manufacture export, and then their manufacture export. Okay, I think you can check this out yourself. It's going to be higher for developed countries. Okay, and then the demand elasticities and export earning instability. So often low price elasticity of demand for agricultural commodities, but supply shock. So when we have low price elasticity of demand for agricultural commodities, but then we have supply shocks for that, it's going to result in huge loss, for the country that export the agricultural commodities. And also when we have low price elasticity of supply for basic commodities, and then we have demand shock, it's going to result in loss also for the producer of the basic commodities. So the result can be export earning instability and then risk to income. Also low income elasticity of demand for primary products. Okay, let's go. The terms of trade and the Prebissinger hypothesis. I think they have more cases, like study cases in the textbook. You can check it out yourself. But anyway, let's talk about the terms of trade and the Prebissinger hypothesis. So the total export earning depends on the total volume of export sold and the price paid for the export. So how many goods and services that you can export, and then how much those that you can export. So Prebis and Singer argued commodity export prices fall over time. So developing countries lose revenue unless they can continually increase the export volume. Prebis and Singer said that when you export something, the price of those things is going to fall over time. So what you can do is you have to increase the volume of the goods that you export. They concluded that developing countries need to avoid dependence on primary exports. So because of that, according to them, developed countries must avoid dependence on primary exports. Some evidence relative prices within manufacturers are also diverging, with falling prices for low-skill products. Okay, so other than you cannot depend on the primary exports, it is also safe not to depend on the low-skill products. Okay, and then the traditional theory of international trade, we have comparative advantage. I think you have learned about this in your international economics course, specifically International Economics 1, if you remember. Comparative advantage means specialization, and then you also have the relative factor endowment and international specialization, or the neoclassical model. You have the static model. You have also Heckscher-Ohlin. You definitely have learned Heckscher-Ohlin in your International Economics 1, or the factor endowment theory. So I'm not going to explain about it in here. But basically the different products require productive factors in different ratios, and then the countries have different endowments of factors of production. Okay, you may notice this Ricardo and Mill is the Ricardian approach. That's in your International Economics 1. And then this is the trade with variable factor proportion and different factors endowment. In the x-axis you have agriculture, and the y-axis you have manufacturing. So when you are in the less developed world, you are going to be, wait, let me, okay, let's see, wait a minute. So for the less developed world, without trade, production and consumption occurs at A. With trade, the production is at B, consumption is at C. So the export is going to be BD and the imports is going to be DC. So this part here, this is the export and the import is this CD. Okay, this is what's going to happen in less developed world. So they will export the agriculture but import the manufactured products. Okay, and then in this case, this is for the rest of the world. You will see that without trade, the production and consumption is going to be at A, but with trade, the production is going to be at B. You notice that in the less developed country, they produce more agriculture goods, but they have to import the manufacturing goods. Okay, and the consumption is going to be at C. So the export is BD and the import is going to be DC. They will import more agriculture stuff and then export more manufacturing stuff. Okay, so that's for the rest of the world. It's different, right, than the less developed world, because in the rest of the world they can export more manufacturing goods. So the main conclusion of the neoclassical model is that all countries gain from trade. Yeah, that's true. Even those who are less competitive, they will still gain from trade. That's why they should trade. And then world output increase with trade, and the countries will tend to specialize in the product that they use their abundant resource intensively. And then the international wage rates and capital costs will gradually tend towards equalization, and the returns to owners' abundant resource will rise relatively. Okay, and the trade will stimulate economic growth. I think everything in here is debatable, especially if you take a look at the phenomena nowadays, but really it's for you to discuss. But theoretically, ideally, this is what's going to be expected as the outcome of international trade, according to the neoclassical model. Okay, and then the trade theory and development, the traditional arguments. So the traditional arguments are: trade stimulates economic growth, trade promotes international and domestic equality, trade promotes reward sectors of comparative advantage, and then international prices and cost of production determine trading volumes, and outward-looking international policy is superior to isolation. Is it true? You tell me. You can argue about everything in here, and if you can show the data, you can definitely have a solid argument. So the following assumptions of the basic neoclassical model have been scrutinized. So it means that the following assumption has been thoroughly studied or thoroughly investigated. So the result of those investigation is the following. So the fixed resource, full employment, and international factors, immobility. So and fixed freely available technology and consumer sovereignty versus product cycle, ongoing development of synthetic substitutes for developing countries' export, and opportunities for dynamic gains in leading sector. And then internal factor mobility versus different types of structural rigidities and perfect competition versus pervasive market power. Okay, I'm not going to read everything in here, but these are the assumption, or this is the idealism assumption for the neoclassical model to be worked. Whether it really works in real life, like I said, it's debatable. You can check a lot of recent paper that either prove or disprove neoclassical model. Okay, let's talk about it one by one. The first one is the fixed resource, full employment, and the international immobility of capital and skilled labor. So the study case for this thing here is the North-South trade models. You can also refer to the Porter's competitive advantage theory that say traditional trade theory applies only to basic factors like unskilled labor and physical resource. It doesn't apply to the more advanced, like for example very high-tech manufacture, so it doesn't apply. But creation of advanced factors such as knowledge, resource, and specialized infrastructure is the first priority. And then central task to escape from the straitjacket of factor-driven national advantage. Basically, in this case, the Porter challenged the competitive advantage theory that say a lot of assumption about regarding unskilled labor and physical resource, because according to Porter, when we have the knowledge, resource, and specialized infrastructure, then the competitive advantage theory doesn't hold anymore. Okay. And then the critique of traditional free trade theory in the context of developing country experience. Alternative theory here, one of them is the Venn for surplus theory. What is it? Let's take a look at this figure. So this is the Venn for surplus theory of trade. So the Venn for surplus theory, it says that when a country can see that they have opportunity in one sector, then they will be thriving, they will do well if they choose to specialize to export in that sector. In this case, for example, if a country finds that it can produce a lot of primary products efficiently from X to X accent, for example, then they can export those. But if and then they, from the revenue that they have from that export, they can import more manufacturing goods, like for example from Y to Y accent, and vice versa. If a country see the opportunity to export manufacturing goods, then that's what they will do, and then from the revenue they will buy more primary products. Okay. And then fixed freely available technology and consumer sovereignty, they are challenged by the product cycle theory and the development of synthetic substitutes from developing country exports. Okay. And then the international factor mobility, perfect competition and uncertainty, increasing returns, imperfect competition, and issues in specialization. So, okay, ideally we will want a free factor mobility, right? And also specialization, but it doesn't happen. Why? Because we have the structural reality in developing countries. The factor cannot move freely, so there is no mobility, and the increasing returns and exercise of monopolistic control over world markets, and then the risk and uncertainty inherent in international trading arrangements. And then the next one is the absence of national government in trading relation. So the role of state when it comes to when it comes to international trade, sometimes it doesn't really work. Like previous chapter, we have talked about how government can fail. So it's obvious that they can also fail in terms of international trade, and then the industrial policy is crafted by the governments and might not be suitable, and the commercial policies instruments are state construct, and the international policies can result in uneven distribution of gains from trade. Okay, and then the concept of balanced trade and international price adjustment, they are unrealistic. For example, you can take a look at the impact of oil price hikes of the 1970s. And then the concept of trade gains according to nationals, it actually enclave economies are promoted by trade, and the difference between GDP and GNI becomes important. So if you want to prove whether trade gains actually good or not good for a country, then you will have to differentiate between GDP and GNI. Okay. And the next one. So these are some conclusion on trade theory and economic development strategy. Trade can lead to a rapid economic growth under some circumstances. And trade seems to reinforce existing income inequalities. That's too bad, right? And trade can benefit developing countries if they can extract trade concessions from developed countries, which doesn't always happen, and developing countries generally must trade. Because you will not be better off with closed economies. So you will still have to trade, even though it might not be as good as it's expected. And the regional cooperation may help developing countries. Okay. So these are some strategies. The first strategy is the debate between export promotion versus import substitution. So export promotion, looking outward and seeing trade barriers. So basically how you're going to push export more and more in order to have more profit from the export. Expanding export of manufactured goods. So in this simplified model, the trade-off is only between exporting primary commodity or manufactured goods, and theoretically exporting manufactured goods is better. So China, for example, they did that really well. And then the second policy is the import substitution. It's still looking inward but still paying outward. So when you want this type of policy, then you need to be aware of tariffs, infant industries, and the theory of protection. So which one is better? Should we promote exports or should we substitute import? Well, I think it's case by case. You cannot just say this one is better than the other. You can look truly at the economic condition of a country. Okay. So this figure show the import substitution and the theory of protection. Let's see. So in this figure, this is the domestic price without trade. So with that, you will have the quantity of Q1 and the price of P1. But in the world price, it's actually P2 here. But if you have, if the government wants to protect the country, the domestic product, then they will have the import price plus tariff in the P3. So what happens if the price is at P3? Then the demand is going to fall to Q2. But if they don't have that tariff prohibitive, the demand is going to be at Q3. Okay, so if the government wants to protect the domestic product, then they will definitely impose prohibitive tariff, resulting the price to be at P3. Okay, and then in the bottom figure here, this is just another illustration. So let's say this is P1 equals P1 in here, and then this is the world price, right? But if the government introduced tariff, then the price of P2 is going to go up to PT here. PT is priced with tariff. So what's going to happen? The demand for the import goods is going to fall, right? And then they are going to switch to the local product. Okay, actually very similar, the above and the bottom figure. Okay, and this is the import substitution industrialization strategy and result. So with the import substitution, they will protect industries and get inefficient and costly, and then foreign firms often benefit more. So this is the disadvantage of import substitution. And then subsidization of imports of capital goods tilts pattern of industrialization and contributes to balance of payment problems, and the overvalued exchange rates hurt export, and it does not stimulate self-reliant integrated industrialization. And then regarding the tariff structure, we have two types of tariff structure, so the nominal rate of protection and the effective rate of protection. Okay, the nominal tariff rate is calculated this way, so T equals to P accent subtract by P divided by P. So P accent is the tariff inclusive price, P is the free trade price. So okay, and then the tariff structure and effective protection, the effective tariff rate, or G, wait a minute, so the effective tariff rate is rho here, so this is rho. Why is it G in here? I don't get it. Maybe it's mentioned. No, I think it's just mistyped. It should be rho. So rho equals to V accent subtract by V divided by V. V accent is the value added per unit output inclusive of the tariff. V is the value added per unit output under free trade. Okay, so when you talk about the effective tariff rate, you talk about the value added per unit of output. Okay, and we still have the debate between export promotion versus import substitution. So the standard argument for tariff protection, why we need tariff protection, is because the source of revenue, we want to protect the source of revenue, and then response to the chronic BOP problems, and then help foster industrial self-reliance and the greater control of economic destinies. I'm not going to say which one is better, export promotion versus import substitution, but whichever it is, like for example, if you choose import substitution, it must be applied selectively and wisely. And the infant industry protection argument is usually the reason why a country choose import substitution, because they want to nurture their industry, therefore infant industry. And then nevertheless, there are many examples of perceived failures, but there are also some success in East Asia, like the South Korea used to have this infant industry policy. Okay, and then we still continue the debate in terms of foreign exchange rate, exchange control, and the devaluation decision. So developing country currencies have often been overvalued. A developing country can devalue currency or can run down reserves. They also can curtail the excess demand through taxes, tariffs, dual exchange rates, and they can use exchange controls. They can switch to freely convertible foreign exchange. These figures show free market and controlled trades of foreign exchange. In the x-axis we have quantity of foreign exchange. In the y-axis we have prices of foreign exchange. So in equilibrium it's going to be this, but when the wait a minute, when the price of foreign exchange, which is unit of domestic currency per unit of foreign exchange, is at PB here, for example, then the quantity of foreign exchange is going to shift lower to M accent. Vice versa, when it's at PA, then the foreign exchange is going to shift through M double accent. Okay. And we also have the chronic payments deficit can be ameliorated by currency devaluation. Okay, we are not going to talk a lot about currency devaluation here. It's really for your international economics too. You're going to have headache learning that in that course, not in this course, so don't worry about it. But basically the deficit is the difference between, this problem here is the currency devaluation is the difference between depreciation and devaluation, and the higher import price result in inflationary wage price spiral, and there is distributional effects as well. Okay, now let's talk about trade optimists and the trade pessimists. To summarize the traditional debate between export promotion versus import substitution. So the trade pessimists will argue that limited growth of world demand for primary exports, so the demand for primary exports is going to be limited, and the secular deterioration in terms of trade, specializing in comparative advantage inhibits industrialization, skill accumulation, and entrepreneurship. Okay, specialization needs skills and entrepreneurship and industrialization. Okay, definitely. And the rise of new protectionism. WTO benefits limited in practice. And then there is trade optimists who thinks that trade liberalization should take place. They will argue that it promotes competition and efficiency. They will argue that it generates pressure for product improvement, it will accelerate overall growth, it attracts foreign capital and expertise, it generates foreign exchange to use for food imports. If agricultural sector lags behind or suffers natural catastrophes, it eliminates distortion caused by government intervention, including corruption and rent-seeking. It promotes equal access to scarce resource, and it enables developing countries to take full advantage of reforms under the WTO. Okay, this is the export-oriented industrialization strategy and some arguments in the literature on why, in principle, it could be effective. Please remember that it's only in principle, or this is just the idea or why it could be effective, because it can overcome so these are the reasons why export-oriented industrialization could be effective. There are market failures in transfer of innovation, and then there are coordination failures that may make industrialization problematic, and then export expansion may facilitate technology transfer through contacts with foreign firms. There may be learning by doing or watching effects in manufacturing sector, and the performance is rigorously tested with the firm attempt to export, and the export targets more visible. Hausman, Huang, and Rodrik say that exporting a mixed goods more typical for a higher income countries predict higher growth, and thus export-oriented industrial policy may help overcome market failures in the process of technological progress. Okay. And then we have the industrialization strategy approach to export policy. So the focus on government intervention to encourage export, especially those with higher skill and technology content, or industrial policy. And the problem is, without proper attention to incentive, industrial policy may be counterproductive too. And then WTA rules and industrial policies, gray areas remain, and the problem is level of competence and political authority of government to carry out policy effectively. So it all depends on the quality of the government. And then the policy approach are addressed in case study. We have talked about this in chapter 12 and chapter 13. Okay, those are the success stories, by the way, in South Korea and Taiwan, if you remember. Okay. Oh, actually we haven't talked about South Korea. It's going to be the next chapter. So this is the South-South trade economic integration. So this is a case study. This is a case study. You can read more in your book. So economic integration, theory and practice. So the growth of trade among developing countries exists. Okay. So there are growth of trade among developing countries, and the integration encourages the rational division of labor among group of countries and increase market size. With the growth between developing countries increase, the integration take place, and the integration will encourage rational divisions of labor among group of countries and increase market size, and it provides opportunity for a coordinated industrial strategy to exploit economies of scale. It will result in trade creation and trade diversion. And the regional trading blocks the globalization trade. So we have some kind of trade group, trade agreement, or trading blocks, whatever you want to call it. We have some kind of trade agreement, let's call it that, such as NAFTA, Mercosur, SADC, ASEAN, and one of the factors that create this trading group is the local condition matter. And then it's still not fully answered whether do blocks promote growth or retard the progress of globalization. Okay, but I mean, one of the result of globalization or international trade is definitely these trading blocks such as NAFTA, ASEAN, and other blocks. Okay, whether it promote growth or not, it has not been answered yet. So trade policies of developed countries, the need for reform and resistance to the new protectionist pressure. Okay. So the rich nation economic and commercial policies matter for developing countries. Well, that's true. Why? Because we have these tariff and non-tariff barriers to developing country export, and then there is adjustment assistance for displaced worker and the general impact of the economic policy. When we talk about this new protectionist pressure, it has a lot to do with the WTO. They have some rules and regulation regarding trade liberalization. You can read more about it in your books. It's not mentioned in the slides here, but you can read it yourself. But anyway, despite the 8 liberalization rounds over 50 years, trade barriers remain in place in agriculture and through various mechanisms to a degree in other sectors. So even though the WTO have at least 8 liberalization for 50 years, it seems like trade barriers still remain in place for agriculture and other sector as well. The Doha Development Round began in 2001, tilted the nominal focus to needs of developing world, but talks remain stalled through the end of 2010 and self-imposed deadline. So it seems like the Doha Development Round doesn't really work either. Okay, so this is the figure that showed the effective tariff faced by income groups in 1997 through 1998. So like I said before, the problem hit worse when you are very poor. So if you are deeply poor, then the effect of tariff is going to be 14%. When you are poor, it's also about 14%, but when you are not poor, it's only about 6%. Okay, so these are some concepts for you to review. So that's all for the international trade. There are a lot of debate in here, and it doesn't really have a conclusion. Is trade good? Is trade bad? It can be both. It depends on the case. Okay, it's case by case. So that's it for this chapter. See you in the next chapter.